Chapter 1. The Weight You're Allowed to Put Down. Somewhere in the room around you, something is finally quiet. Maybe it took a while to get here tonight. The day still humming faintly behind your eyes, the way a screen keeps a faint ghost of its last image for a moment after it goes dark. That is all right. You do not have to switch it off all at once. Let it fade in its own time, the way most true endings do, slowly, and without asking your permission first. Feel the places where your body is being held right now. The mattress, or the cushion, or the arm of whatever you are curled against. Let your weight sink another half-inch into it. There is nothing left for you to hold up tonight. Whatever you have been carrying, a conversation you keep replaying, a task still sitting unfinished somewhere at the edge of tomorrow, a small worry with no shape you can quite name, you can set it down now, gently, the way you would set down something you were afraid to drop and have finally realized you are allowed to simply put on the ground instead. This is the Lore Den, and what follows tonight is a long story told slowly enough that you were never meant to hold on to all of it. There is no version of tonight where leaving early counts as leaving too soon. If your eyes close somewhere in the middle of this and do not open again until morning, that is not you missing something. That is this working exactly as it was built to work. Nothing here needs to be remembered. It only needs to be near you for a while, the way a familiar voice is near you, easy to lean on and just as easy to drift away from. Tonight, the story is about a woman who was never given a single choice that mattered. Not the sickness that moved through her before she could speak. Not the name she was given, which was never fully her own name so much as a description of who she belonged to. Not the war she was sent to fight, or the flower that bloomed out of her when that war broke her open, or the centuries of sleep that followed, or the tree that slowly rotted around her while she waited for someone who was never coming back. She would be called many things by the time this is over. A blade, a goddess, undefeated for a very long time, and then, at last not, wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day you are setting down behind you, let her come to you slowly. She has been waiting a very long while already. She can wait a little longer while you get comfortable. This is Elden Ring, though not the version you might remember from a controller, gripped too tightly in both hands. The deaths, the long gray, walk back toward whatever killed you. The particular fear that comes with a boss health bar that will not stop refilling. This is the version underneath that one. The version made of half sentences and item descriptions and things certain characters say only once, quietly, if you happen to be standing close enough to hear them. It is, in its own patient way, a gentler story than the game ever lets you notice while you are playing it, sword drawn, heart hammering, thinking only about the next handful of seconds. Tonight, you have nothing to survive. Nothing is trying to kill you. You only have to listen and let your own next few hours be soft ones instead. Maybe you already know a little of what it feels like to be defined by something you never chose. A body that did something without asking you first. A name that came with expectations attached before you had done anything to earn or deserve them. A role in someone else's story that swallowed the room where your own story might have grown instead. It does not have to be nearly as vast or as strange as an outer god or a rotting flower blooming out of a demigod's chest for the shape of it to feel familiar somewhere quiet in you. If any part of what follows tonight lands somewhere tender, let it land there gently, and then let it go, the way you are letting go of everything else right now. This is not a lesson. It is only a story, told slowly, about someone who never once got to put her own version of this feeling down until, in the end, she finally did. You do not need to remember any names tonight. You do not need to keep track of which brother did what, or which battle came before which sleep. If a detail slips past you on its way toward wherever your own thoughts are already drifting, let it go. It was never the point. The point is only the shape of the whole thing, gentle and sad, and somewhere underneath the sadness, quietly kind. And that shape will still be there waiting for you, whether you catch every word of it or none of them at all. Let us begin, gently, at the beginning. Before there was a woman called Malenia, there was a god that wanted nothing except a wound to live inside. Chapter 2. The God that was already waiting. Before there was a woman called Malenia. There was a sickness so old it predates almost every name anyone in this story would go on to give it. This world calls forces like it outer gods, presences that exist beyond the golden light of the Erd Tree entirely, watching from somewhere past the edges of the sky, the way someone might watch a house through a window without ever once being invited inside. The Golden Order worships the one it calls the Greater Will, and behaves, most of the time, as though its own scripture were the only scripture that could possibly exist. It is not. Other things watch too, and want to, and every so often reach down through whatever crack the golden world was careless enough to leave open. One of those things is rot, not a curse invented by a storyteller for the occasion, and not a metaphor either, however useful it becomes as one later tonight. The game's own fragments confirm it plainly, in places most players never pause long enough to read twice. A map describing a lake deep beneath the earth calls that lake the resting place of an outer god, sealed thereby in the words of the item that names him. A blind swordsman wielding a flowing blade. A small charm worn by dancers who serve this same presence repeats the detail from another angle that this god of decay was once bound in that same lake by that same swordsman, whoever he truly was, however long ago that binding actually happened. The story does not resolve exactly who this blind swordsman was, or why a single figure with a single blade succeeded where an entire golden religion might have failed. Some readings frame him as an early champion of the very order that would later forget him. Others suggest he served something stranger and older that has no name any surviving text still remembers. Both readings exist, side by side, and neither cancels the other out. What survives clearly, in the parts of this world that do not lie, is simpler and colder than any explanation. Something old and hungry was sealed away in a lake beneath the earth, and it never once stopped being hungry while it waited. It helps, too, to picture what this god's own domain actually looks like, deep beneath the earth where it was first bound. A lake, still and heavy, its waters thick with something that is not quite water anymore, quiet in the specific way only very old, very patient things manage to stay quiet. Nothing about that lake announces the scale of what it actually holds. It simply waits there, the way it has always waited, untroubled by centuries, in no particular hurry to be found by anyone at all. Rot, in this world's own accounting, is called one of the divine elements the outer gods reach for when they touch a life directly. It eats at flesh the way flame eats at wood, patient and total, but it is never described as simple destruction. It is described as a form of death that gives rise to life in turn, decay folding back into rebirth, the way a fallen tree eventually becomes the soil that grows the next one. Sit with that for a moment, because it will matter again before tonight is over. This is not a god of pure ending. It is a god of transformation that happens to run almost entirely through suffering. The way certain flowers will only open once something else nearby has already finished dying. For a long while, this particular god had no one to answer for it directly, no priesthood, no chosen emissary carrying its will out into the world the way the greater will has its golden order and the frenzied flame has its madmen howling in the dark. It waited, masterless, sealed beneath its lake, the way anything patient enough eventually learns to wait. It would eventually find someone to answer for it in a different corner of this world's history, in a chapter this telling will only touch briefly tonight, because a different night already gave it in full. A woman named Romina would come to cultivate this same divine essence deliberately, in the hidden realm beyond the world most tarnished ever see, shaping masterless rot into something closer to a doctrine. That is not tonight's story. Tonight's story belongs to someone the rot found first, and found by accident, long before anyone thought to give it a scripture at all. It is worth pausing, too, on something the Golden Order rarely said aloud but practiced with total consistency. Every order this world has ever built manages, sooner or later, to produce its own outcasts, the ones its own scripture cannot make room for, no matter how carefully that scripture is written. Sometimes, that exile arrives because of a birth nobody asked for, a story for another night. Sometimes it arrives instead, as a body simply failing to hold the shape the Golden Order insists a blessed body must hold, rot moving through blood that was supposed to carry nothing but light. The Golden Order never announced Malenia's illness as evidence of anything doctrinal. It did not have to. Illness inside the Golden Bloodline was already, by its own unspoken logic, a kind of quiet failure. Proof that something had slipped through wherever the light was meant to be strongest. Nobody said this to her directly, not while she was young enough for it to still be said kindly. It simply hung over her the way weather hangs over a field, unspoken and unavoidable, coloring every year of her life that followed. To understand how that accident happened, you have to understand something strange and sad about the two people at the very center of tonight's telling, and about the god they descended from without either of them ever asking to. Queen Marika ruled the Golden Order from its very beginning, worshipped in time not merely as its queen, but as its living deity, the goddess the entire Golden World knelt toward. And Marika, in a truth this world keeps almost entirely hidden until very near its own ending, was never simply herself. She and a figure called Radagon, who most of the lands between believed to be her husband and consort, were, in some manner this story does not fully explain, and does not need to, the same being, split somehow across two separate bodies, for reasons buried deeper than almost anything else in this world's history. Two children were born to this fractured, doubled figure, a matched pair the Golden World would come to call the twin prodigies. Miquella, born first, Malenia, born just after him, close enough in time that the two of them would spend the whole of their lives being spoken of as a single unit rather than as two separate people. Both were born Empyreans, the rarest kind of child the Golden Bloodline could produce. Marked from birth with the potential to become gods in their own right, should they ever choose to reach for it. That should have been a blessing beyond almost anything else this world had to offer, and it was, in its way. But it came, for these two children specifically, with a cost that nothing in the Golden Order's own scripture had ever quite prepared it to explain. Because their mother was fractured, split against her own nature into two selves that did not fully know each other, something in that fracture reached down into her children too, and marked each of them with a wound that mirrored the wound their own parent carried, quietly, underneath a great deal of golden light. Miquella was cursed to remain a child forever, his body refusing. For reasons this world's own texts treat as genuinely mysterious rather than simply explained, to ever grow past the years of his early childhood. And Malenia, his twin, was marked instead by rot, not metaphorical decay, the actual attention of the actual god sealed beneath that lake, somehow reaching up and finding, in a newborn Empyrean princess. Exactly the kind of wound it had always been, waiting patiently to fill. There is one more piece of context worth understanding before this telling goes any further, because it explains why an affliction like this one was allowed to happen to an Empyrean at all, rather than being caught and corrected the moment it first appeared. Empyreans are not simply gifted children in this world's own accounting. They are vessels, in the most literal sense this world's cosmology allows, each one carrying inside them the potential to seal death itself away again, the way Marika once sealed it away at the founding of her own Golden Order. That destiny is not gentle, It has, across this world's long history, meant that an Empyrean's own body becomes something other people are willing to fight wars over, willing to wait centuries for, willing, in certain cases, to manipulate entirely toward their own ends. Malenia's rot was never treated by the wider Golden World as simply a tragedy befalling a beloved princess. It was treated, quietly and coldly, as a flaw in a vessel that mattered enormously to forces far larger than any one family's grief. This is worth remembering underneath everything else tonight's story tells you about her. She was never only a sister to be saved. She was also, whether she wanted to be or not, something the whole architecture of this world's power had a stake in. This is the third thing tonight's story wants you to understand plainly, and it is worth stating outright rather than only implying it. The gods in this world are real, and none of them care about any specific person. Not the greater will, distant behind its own golden scripture, not the rot, ancient and patient beneath its lake. It did not choose Malenia because it recognized something remarkable in her. It found her the way water finds the lowest point in any landscape, without intention, without malice. Simply because a wound had opened somewhere close enough to fill, and wounds are the only thing this particular god has ever known how to want. It helps, too, to understand that this hunger was never unique to Rot alone. Elsewhere in this world's cosmology, other outer gods reach down through their own particular cracks in the same indifferent way, each wanting something specific and inhuman rather than wanting any single person. One offers fire built from suffering to whoever is desperate enough to burn alongside it. Another claims the cold distance of the moon itself, favored by those who would rather escape their fate than fulfill it. None of them want a person, exactly. They want what a person can be made to carry. The way a riverbed does not want the water so much as it simply shapes whatever water happens to run through it. Rot is only one voice among several calling from beyond the edges of the world the Golden Order insists is the whole of reality, and it found, in a newborn Empyrean princess, exactly the kind of wound it had always been patient enough to wait for. Picture it plainly, because the story deserves the image stated once, clearly, before it moves any further. An infant princess, born into golden light and golden expectation, already beginning, in ways her family would spend the rest of her childhood trying and failing to stop, to rot from somewhere deep inside her own body. Flesh that would not simply grow the way flesh is meant to grow. Blood that carried something ancient and hungry through her veins, instead of the clean golden light her lineage was supposed to guarantee. She did not do anything to deserve this. She had not lived long enough yet to do anything at all, and already, before she could walk or speak or understand what was happening to her, something older than her entire bloodline had already decided, without asking her, what the rest of her life was going to be about. Consider, for a moment, what this must have meant for the parents who could not fix it. Marika and Radagon, whatever else can be said about the strange fractured being they shared between them, were still, underneath all that theology and all that golden light, the two people who had to watch their own newborn daughter begin to fail in a way no scripture in their own religion had ever prepared them to name. There is no surviving record of grief on Marika's part, no private lament preserved anywhere in this world's fragments. That silence is worth noticing rather than filling in with an easy answer. Perhaps she grieved privately and left no trace of it. Perhaps a being who would go on to shatter the Elden Ring itself rather than watch her favored son die in a different war had already. By the time Malenia was born, spent whatever capacity she had for that particular kind of grief. The lore does not resolve this cleanly, and tonight's telling will not pretend otherwise. What can be said honestly is only this. A newborn began to rot in a household that ruled the known world, and no amount of golden light, no amount of power, no amount of devotion from anyone standing near her was enough to simply make it stop. Sleep well, if sleep is already finding you. When we return, we will meet the two children this affliction actually shaped, before either of them had a name history would remember, back when they were only a sister trying to keep her body from ending too soon, and a brother who could not stop trying to save her. Chapter 3. Born Cursed. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow, all the way down to something you barely notice happening anymore. What follows is the part of this story that survives almost entirely in fragments and item descriptions and half-remembered histories, because it happened in the private, unwitnessed years of two children's early lives, long before either of them became the figures this world would eventually build legends around. Miquella watched his twin sister's body begin to fail her almost from the moment either of them could understand what failing meant. He was, by every account this world preserves, a kind and gentle child, gifted with a compassion that seemed to exceed even the golden bloodline's own considerable capacity for it, and he turned every ounce of that compassion. From the earliest years, either of them can be traced toward a singular goal: saving Malenia, not defeating an enemy, not conquering a kingdom, not proving himself worthy of his mother's golden light, the way so many of his siblings would spend their own lives attempting. Simply saving one person, his sister, from a sickness that the entire theological apparatus of the Golden Order had no answer for. Picture what that devotion must have looked like from the inside of an ordinary day, because it is easy to let a sentence like devoted his life to saving her slide past as an abstraction rather than a lived, hour-by-hour reality. A young boy, gifted and golden, and already marked with his own strange curse of a body that would not age, spending what should have been the ordinary years of a childhood instead poring over whatever fragments of healing scripture the golden capital possessed, asking questions the priests around him did not know how to answer, and eventually stopped trying to. He was not, by most surviving accounts, resentful of the time this cost him. He simply could not imagine a version of his own life that was not organized around hers. This is worth naming plainly, the way this telling has tried to name things plainly tonight. Some children raised inside golden light spend their whole lives trying to become worthy of it. Miquella spent his trying to build a second, private religion out of nothing but the hope that his sister might someday simply get to stop suffering. He tried, at first, the only tools his world had ever given him. He turned to Golden Order fundamentalism, a stricter, more devoted interpretation of his mother's own faith, believing perhaps that a purer application of the light that had made him might also be strong enough to unmake what had been done to his sister. It failed her completely. The Rot did not care how devoutly anyone prayed to the light that had, in its own way, produced the very fracture that let the Rot inside her in the first place. Miquella abandoned that path entirely once its failure became undeniable, and in abandoning it, he began the long work of building something the Golden Order itself had never once offered. A different kind of gold, not the light of the Erd Tree, inherited and unquestioned. Something crafted instead, deliberately, by his own hands, meant specifically to hold back what his mother's own faith could not even name honestly. He called this new invention unalloyed gold, and its very first purpose, before it became anything grander, was keeping his sister's body from finishing what the Rot had already started inside her. He shaped a needle from it, small enough to be carried, precise enough to be placed directly into the source of the affliction itself and its function. Plainly stated by the object itself in the years that followed, was to ward away the meddling of outer gods, capable, it was believed, of forestalling a rotting sickness that had no other cure anywhere in this world. He placed that needle inside his own twin sister's body, and for a long while, it worked. Not as a cure, as a stay of execution, renewed constantly, a wall built out of gold instead of stone, holding back a flood that never once stopped pressing against it. It did not stop at a single needle. Where the Rot had already taken more than it should have been allowed to take, unalloyed gold became something else entirely for her, replacing what her own body had already lost. A prosthetic arm, crafted with the same devotion and the same golden material, restored to her a limb the sickness had already claimed before either of them were done growing up. Think about what it must have been like to grow up learning to fight with a limb that was not, in any ordinary sense, entirely her own. A prosthetic built from unalloyed gold does not move the way flesh moves, does not tire the way flesh tires, does not ache the way flesh aches when it has been overworked. It is possible that this gap, small and mechanical as it sounds, is part of what made her eventually so fearsomely difficult to fight. A body that has already had to relearn itself once, entirely, from the inside, tends to develop a relationship with its own limits that ordinary bodies never need to develop. She was not simply strong. She had already survived losing a piece of herself and rebuilding around the absence, and whatever she became afterward carried that rebuilding inside it the same way a healed break carries a slightly different shape than the bone that came before it. Think for a moment about what that actually means. A sister who had already, by some point in her own childhood, lost part of her own body to an illness she never chose, wearing gold in its place, gold her brother had made specifically because the world that raised them both had nothing else to offer either of them. This is a kind of love that this story will not pretend is simple. It kept her alive. It also meant that, from a very young age, some part of what Malenia physically was had already been replaced by something built rather than grown, chosen by someone else's hands rather than by her own body's own nature. Try to imagine, for a moment, what any of this actually felt like from Malenia's own side of it, since almost nothing this world preserves is spoken directly in her own voice about these years. A girl who understood, long before she had the language to argue with it, that her own body was a battlefield other people had to keep intervening on simply to keep her alive. A needle placed inside her by loving hands, and still a needle. A missing limb, and then a golden one in its place, beautiful and functional, and never quite the same thing as the arm that had grown there naturally before the sickness took it. This is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It is possible to be loved completely, cared for constantly, saved again and again by someone who would clearly rather die than fail you, and still, underneath all of that devotion, to feel like the one thing nobody is asking you is what you yourself would have chosen if anyone had thought to ask. And here is the piece of this that deserves to be sat with longer than the rest, because it shapes everything that follows for the whole of her life. Malenia did not only inherit a sickness from this, she inherited an identity. She became, almost from the moment she was old enough to carry a blade, Miquella's sworn protector. His blade in the most literal sense this world's language allows. Malenia, Blade of Miquella. That title would follow her for the rest of her existence. Spoken by her own mouth in the very last fight most tarnished will ever have with her, and it is worth asking plainly what a title like that actually costs a person to carry. What did Malenia want underneath everything the rot and the title and the armor eventually became? As plainly as this story can state it, she wanted what almost anyone wants who has spent their whole life being cared for at the cost of being asked. Not rescue, exactly, since rescue had already been tried and had already, in its own way, become another kind of cage. She wanted to matter as herself, not only as evidence of her brother's devotion, or as the living wall standing between the world and the sickness inside her. What did wanting that cost her? Nearly everything, in the end, because the only way this world ever let her feel fully seen was through victory, through an unbroken record of never losing, which meant that the version of herself the world actually valued was never the frightened, rotting girl underneath the armor, only the undefeated blade standing in front of it. What does that cost reveal about the world that raised her? that a kingdom built on golden perfection will always find a use for its wounded, so long as the wounded are willing to turn that wound into a weapon and never once ask to simply set it down. Not X, but Y. She was not simply his sister, who happened to also serve as his protector. Her entire public identity, the only name history would come to know her by, was built directly out of her relationship to him, not Malenia, who exists as herself, independent, whole, entitled to wants and fears and a life that belongs only to her. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, defined first and always in relation to someone else's story. Ask yourself what it costs a person to have their whole name, their whole reputation, their whole meaning to the world built around the phrase belonging to. It is worth remembering the next time this story returns to that title that it was never simply an honor. It was also, quietly and completely, an erasure. The same erasure that so often hides itself inside the language of devotion. None of this means Miquella loved her poorly, and the story does not want you to hear it that way. He loved her, by every surviving account, completely, and he spent centuries trying to save her in whatever way remained available to him. But love, even total, even sincere, even utterly well intentioned, can still build a cage around the very person it is trying hardest to protect. Both things are true simultaneously. Miquella's devotion to his sister was real, and it was also the first of many forces in her life that would decide, on her behalf, exactly what shape her existence was allowed to take. She led an army of her own in time, knights sworn entirely to her rather than to any golden throne, called the Clean Rot Knights, and the word chosen for them matters more than it might first appear to. Clean, set against the rot she herself carried inside her own body every single day of her life. She became, in other words, the living symbol of resistance against the exact thing that was quietly consuming her from the inside, an undefeated warrior built out of a body that had never once, in her entire life, been allowed to simply exist without a war being fought inside it. What does that cost a person, to spend every waking hour being the strongest possible answer to the very affliction eating you alive? What does it reveal about the world that raised her, that the only role it ever offered a sick, rotting child was to become the fiercest warrior it had ever produced, rather than simply letting her rest? Picture the knights themselves for a moment, gathering to her banner one at a time over the years, each arriving with their own private reasons for choosing to serve a commander most of the Golden World would rather not look at too closely. Some came for the honor of serving an Empyrean directly, a rare and coveted position, regardless of what quietly lived inside her. Others, it is easy to imagine, came because they recognized something of themselves in her, a person who had learned early that survival meant becoming impressive enough that nobody dared ask what it cost. An order built around a wounded commander tends to draw exactly this kind of soldier, the ones who have already learned in their own smaller lives. That competence can be a very effective way of making people stop asking uncomfortable questions. Consider for a moment what it must have meant to be one of her knights rather than Malenia herself. To swear yourself entirely to a commander who carried, quietly and constantly, a sickness none of you were permitted to speak of directly, knowing that whatever fate eventually caught up with her might just as easily catch up with the army standing closest to her. This was not a burden most of the Clean Rot Knights seemed to have resented. If anything, the fierce, near total loyalty they carried for her reads, across what fragments survive, as something closer to reverence. The particular devotion soldiers reserve for a commander who has clearly already suffered more than she has ever asked any of them to suffer in her name. She never demanded a loyalty from them that she had not already demanded far more completely of herself. Sleep well. When we return, we will see what Miquella built for her once the needle and the prosthetics had done all they could. a tree meant to hold what nothing else in this world had room for. Chapter 4: The Tree He Built for Her. Welcome back. Get comfortable wherever you are and let everything slow down around you a little further. Once Miquella had abandoned his mother's faith entirely, once fundamentalism had proven it could not save the one person he most wanted to save, he did something almost no other figure in this entire world's long guarded history ever attempted. He built somewhere new for his sister to exist, entirely separate from the Golden Order that had failed her, and he built it with his own body as much as with his own hands. He found, somewhere distant from the Golden Capital's watchful light, a sapling, small and unremarkable, the kind of thing most travelers would walk past without a second glance, and he watered it patiently, deliberately, with his own Empyrean blood, the same rare and potent blood that marked him as capable of godhood himself. It grew in time into something the lands between had never seen before, a second holy tree entirely apart from the Erd tree that ruled every other corner of this world, its branches climbing skyward the way a plea climbs toward whatever it hopes might be listening. This world would come to call it the Holic tree, and beneath its roots, older than the tree itself, sat a fortress called Elphael, brace of the Holic tree, built to shelter everyone this new order would come to gather beneath its branches. Miquella did not simply plant this tree and leave it to grow on its own. At some point, in an act of devotion the story asks you to sit with, rather than rush past, he wove himself a cocoon and placed himself directly inside the trunk of the tree itself, nurturing it not from a careful distance, but from somewhere inside its own growing body, indistinguishable, in that moment, from the tree he had made. Think about what that means for a person to do, not merely giving resources, or blood or time, giving his own physical presence over entirely, folding himself into the very thing he was trying to build, so that the tree and the brother who made it became for a while almost the same living thing. He built this place, ultimately, for one reason above every other: to give Malenia somewhere to exist that was not defined by the Golden Order's failure to help her, and somewhere the rot inside her might finally be held at bay for good, rather than merely delayed, needle by needle, year by year. And it is worth naming plainly what this makes Malenia within her own brother's greatest creation, because the master framework this story was built from insists on the distinction, and the distinction matters completely. She did not build the Halic tree. Miquella built it, for her, out of his own blood and his own body and his own aching, total devotion. Malenia's role within it was never architect. It was protector, guardian of a sanctuary someone else had made, standing watch over a gift she never once asked for and could never fully repay, because the debt itself had never been offered as something repayable in the first place. Elphael filled, over time, with people who had nowhere else in this world to go. Cleanrot knights, sworn to Malenia's own service, patrolled its branches. Haligtree knights guarded its lower halls, and into its boughs came a woman named Loretta, once a knight of Caria, from a distant realm called Liurnia, ruled by an entirely different family with its own long history of grief. Loretta had gone looking, in her own life, for a safe haven for a persecuted people called the Albinorics, hunted and hated across much of this world for reasons as arbitrary and as cruel as the reasons that had shackled the Omens in their own separate darkness elsewhere in this same story. She found that haven, eventually, in the branches of Miquella's tree, and she remained there, guarding its threshold, offering to another people entirely the exact kind of sanctuary Miquella had built originally for a sister he could not bear to lose. Loretta's own story deserves a moment of its own before this telling moves past her, because she is easy to mistake for a background detail rather than what she actually is. Another version of the same wound this whole story keeps returning to. She had once served a noble Carian house in Liurnia, sworn to a family with its own long and complicated legacy of loss, and at some point in her life she chose to walk away from that service entirely, carrying nothing with her but a sworn desire to find somewhere safe for people the wider world had already decided to hate. The Albinorics she sought shelter for were despised across much of this world for reasons no more coherent than the reasons that had shackled the omens in the dark beneath Lindell, a difference of appearance mistaken, generation after generation, for a difference of worth. Loretta did not build them a tree of their own. She simply found one already growing, already sheltering a rotting princess and the brother who could not save her, and asked whether there was room enough beneath its branches for one more kind of outcast. There was. In time, she would die guarding that same threshold, protecting the tree's approach from travelers who might have come to help it just as easily as travelers who came to harm it. Unable, in the end, to tell the difference in time to choose which one was standing in front of her. Think too about the Albinorics themselves for a moment, the people Loretta crossed half a continent to find shelter for. They were hated across much of this world for a pale, luminous appearance that marked them as different in a way the wider population had decided, long before any of them were born, could not be tolerated nearby. It is worth noticing how often this exact shape repeats itself throughout tonight's telling. A body that looks or grows or fails differently than the ruling order expects, treated as evidence of some deeper wrongness rather than simply as one more way a body can be a body. The Albinorics found in Miquella's tree the same thing Malenia had been given there, a place to exist without first having to apologize for the shape they had been born into. It is one of the few unambiguously gentle threads in this entire story, and it deserves to be named as exactly that. A tree built out of one boy's desperate love for his dying sister ended up sheltering an entire persecuted people who had nothing at all to do with either of them, simply because there was room, and because Loretta was willing to walk a very long way to make sure that room got used. Sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to miss entirely if you are only listening for Malenia's own name. The Halleck tree became, almost by accident, a home not only for one rotting princess, but for an entire scattered category of the unwanted, the cursed, the hunted, gathered together beneath branches, grown from a single brother's desperate love for a single sister. Every order produces its own outcasts. This story has already told you once tonight, in the context of a golden capital that could not tolerate anything it had not personally approved of first. It is worth noticing, here, the quieter and gentler mirror of that same truth. Every act of total devotion, it turns out, can also produce its own sanctuary, gathering in whoever else the wider world had already decided to throw away. Picture the tree itself for a moment, the way it must have looked in its earliest, healthiest years, before this story's own rot found its way into the roots. Branches the color of the Erd tree's own gold, climbing higher than almost anything else built by mortal or divine hands in the whole of the lands between, alive with the quiet activity of an entire community that had finally been given somewhere to simply exist without apology. It must have felt for a while like proof that Miquella's strange and total devotion had actually worked, that love, built carefully enough, poured out completely enough, really could make a place safe from everything that had tried to destroy it. Hold on to that image a moment longer than feels necessary, because it will not last, and this story owes it its due before it starts to fade. None of it was enough, in the end, to actually cure what lived inside Malenia's own body. The needle held the rot back. It did not remove it. And a tree, however holy, however grown from an Empyrean's own blood, is still, underneath everything, a living thing, vulnerable to whatever grows inside the people sheltering beneath it. This is worth remembering clearly before this telling moves any further, because it will matter again, more painfully, before tonight is over. Miquella built his sister a home meant to finally let her simply exist without a war happening inside her. He could not have known, when he wove himself into that tree's trunk and poured his own blood into its roots, that the very thing his home was built to protect her from would eventually become the thing that quietly unmade the home itself. Picture what Elfiel actually feels like to walk through, centuries later, for anyone who eventually finds their way there. Golden architecture, unmistakably beautiful even in ruin, laced everywhere with the same rot that lives inside the woman sleeping at its heart. Knights still standing guard long after the cause they guarded has become almost unrecognizable. Some of them barely distinguishable anymore from the rot they were sworn to resist. It is one of the more quietly devastating places in the whole of the lands between, precisely because it does not look like a ruin the way a battlefield looks like a ruin. It looks, instead, like devotion that simply kept going long after it stopped making sense to keep going. Knights patrolling halls built to shelter a sanctuary that has itself become the very sickness it was meant to hold at bay. Every person still standing guard there made a choice, at some point, to keep serving a home that had already begun quietly killing them, the same way Malenia herself never stopped serving a brother whose gift was slowly poisoning the both of them. Rest now. When we return, we will follow Malenia away from this tree entirely, southward, toward a battle that would come to define the rest of her existence, and toward the vow that sent her there in the first place. Chapter 5: The Vow and the March to Caelid. Welcome back. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm again. What follows is a story this channel has already told in much greater depth on a different night. The long and tangled history of a promise Miquella made and unmade and eventually remade again centuries later in a realm this telling will not travel to tonight. Tonight only needs the piece of that story that belongs to Malenia, the piece where she is not the architect of the vow but its enforcer, sent to answer for a promise her brother had made at the exact moment that promise came due. It helps to remember, too, roughly what era of this world's history this march actually belongs to. This is not a peacetime story. By the time Malenia leads her knight south, the golden order that raised her has already begun coming apart at its own seams. Demigod fighting demigod across half the lands between, and a long civil war this channel has already given its own full telling elsewhere. Armies moving between regions, alliances shifting, old vows suddenly needing to be honored or abandoned as the entire golden world braced for what was coming. Malenia's march to Caelid was not an isolated event, plucked out of a peaceful world for no reason. It was one movement inside a much larger unraveling, a single demigod's private debt coming due at almost exactly the moment every other demigod's debts were also coming due, all at once, all across the same collapsing kingdom. Somewhere in the history this world does not fully explain, Miquella extended a vow toward another demigod entirely, a warlord and general named Rodin. The kind of promise that binds two great and powerful figures together across years and armies and entire campaigns of war. What exactly the vow demanded and why Radon's answer to it mattered so completely to Miquella is a longer story than tonight has room for, and it belongs, in full, to a different telling this channel has already given. What matters here is simpler, and, in its own way, sadder. When the moment came to hold Radon to whatever he had promised, it was not Miquella who marched south to collect on it. It was Malenia. She gathered her clean-rot knights, that undefeated army built out of her own hard-won resistance to the rot inside her, and she led them on a long march south, through Liurnia of the Lakes, through Limgrave, toward the region that would come to be called Caelid, where Radon's own forces, the Redmane, waited to meet her. Picture that march for a moment, because it is easy to skip past as simply an army moving from one place to another on a map, and there is a great deal of unrecorded ordinary life folded into a phrase that's simple. Days of walking through lakeside mist, through fields still green before Caelid's own particular ruin had spread anywhere near this far. Knights who had sworn themselves entirely to a woman they loved and feared in roughly equal measure, aware, in the way any close guard eventually becomes aware that their commander carried something private and dangerous just beneath her armor, never spoken of directly, never once slowing her step. An entire order of knights, sworn to a woman who was, underneath her armor and her reputation, still quietly rotting from the inside with every step she took, walking for days across half a continent to settle a promise that was never actually hers to begin with. She was not marching for her own sake. She was marching because her brother's word needed defending, and she was, as she had always been, the blade he reached for whenever his own hands were not enough to finish something himself. This is worth sitting with honestly before the battle itself arrives, because it is the clearest possible illustration of everything this telling has already asked you to notice about her. Malenia did not choose the rot that lived inside her body from the moment she was born. She did not choose the tree her brother built to shelter her, however gratefully she came to guard it, and she did not choose this war either. It was Miquella's vow, Miquella's promise, Miquella's need answered, and Malenia was simply the instrument through which that need finally found its resolution, the way a sword does not choose which battle it is carried into. She had already, by this point in her life, been shaped so completely around serving her brother's purposes that marching an entire army into a war she had no personal stake in probably did not even register, to her, as a question worth asking twice. What awaited her in Caelid was Radon himself, called by his own people the Star Scourge, a general whose reputation for strength had spread across the length of this entire world. He commanded gravity itself as a weapon, an ability so singular this world's own histories treat it almost as a force of nature rather than a simple skill any warrior might learn. He rode into war astride enormous war horses, sometimes several bound together, into a single impossible mount, and he had never, in all his long life as a soldier, met an opponent capable of matching him completely. His own soldiers, the Redmane, are remembered less for fear of him than for a fierce, near total loyalty, the kind an army only offers a commander who has led them somewhere and back again more times than any of them can count. That loyalty would go on to matter more than anyone marching south with Malenia that week could have guessed, in ways this telling will only touch briefly rather than following all the way to their end, since what became of Radon afterward belongs to a story already told elsewhere. For now, on the morning this battle actually happened, he was simply what his whole reputation promised: undefeated, beloved by the soldiers who followed him, and about to meet, for the first time in his life, someone who could not lose to him either. Malenia would be the first. Sleep well if you are drifting now. When we return, we will watch what happened when an unstoppable general finally met an opponent who could not lose either, and the flower that bloomed out of that impossible collision. Chapter 6: The Battle of Aeonia. Welcome back. Let everything slow down around you, further than it already has. What follows is one of the most consequential single afternoons in the entire history of this world, though almost nobody living in it, by the time a tarnished Finlay arrives centuries later, remembers it as anything other than a ruined, festering swamp with a strange name. Sit with that contrast for a moment before the battle itself begins. An event large enough to reshape an entire region's geology, reduced eventually to a place people simply learned to avoid, its true history dissolved into rot the same way almost everything touched by rot eventually dissolves. Malenia and Radon met in a field southwest of a place called Celia, town of sorcery, each at the head of an army that had never once known real defeat. What followed was not a quick or a merciful fight. It was, by every surviving account, a duel between two demigods who were, in the truest and most literal sense, evenly matched, neither one able to break the other, despite everything each of them brought to bear. Think about what that actually means for a moment before the ending arrives. Two people, both shaped from birth into weapons of one kind or another, both denied any real say in the wars their lives were built around, finally meeting an opponent capable of matching them completely, and finding in that meeting not triumph, but a mirror. Neither of them had ever been stopped before. Now, at last, each of them had found the one person who would not simply fall down and let them win. Imagine the shape of that duel for a moment. Two of the most feared warriors this world had ever produced, each backed by an army that had marched a long way to see this exact moment happen, neither one giving the other the single opening that would have ended it cleanly. Blade against gravity itself, precision against overwhelming force, an entire afternoon spent by two people who had each spent their whole lives being told they could not be stopped, discovering, blow by blow, that the other one genuinely could not be stopped either. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that discovery, worth naming before the battle's actual ending arrives. Malenia had spent her whole life being the answer to a war nobody had ever fully explained to her. Rodon had spent his being the answer to every war his own people had ever needed answered. Neither of them, in all that time, had ever had to reckon honestly with the possibility of losing, and here, at last, both of them were forced to reckon with it at exactly the same moment. In exactly the same field, against exactly each other. It was Malenia who broke the stalemate, though not in any way either side could have wanted. Somewhere in the fighting, the needle Miquella had placed inside her all those years ago, the small, precise piece of unalloyed gold that had held the rot at bay for her entire adult life, finally shattered. It is worth imagining what that moment actually felt like, though no surviving text describes it directly. Every year of careful suppression, every quiet act of holding herself together through sheer will and her brother's careful craftsmanship, ending in an instant, in the middle of a battlefield, with no warning and no way to stop what came next. Try to picture the last exchanges of that duel before the needle finally gave out, because it is worth understanding that this was not a single sudden accident so much as the end of a long mounting strain. Blow after blow, hour after hour, by some accounts, two bodies already pushed past what either of them had ever been asked to endure before. Malenia's own restraint, the discipline that had let her carry an entire order of knights and an entire brother's hope on her back for years, without once losing her composure, finally reaching the outer limit of what discipline alone could hold together. There is no shame in that ending, whatever the golden world might have said about it afterward. She did not break because she was weak. She broke because something old and patient and utterly indifferent to her own wishes had been waiting her entire life for exactly this kind of pressure. And pressure like that, sustained long enough, eventually finds every seam a person has, no matter how carefully those seams were built. What came next was everything the needle had been holding back for her entire life, released all at once. Her own flowering incantation, called in this world's own language Scarlet Aeonia, bloomed outward from her body, scattering what witnesses would come to describe as Aeonian butterflies across the battlefield, and the landscape itself began to change beneath the force of it. Rot spreading outward in every direction, driving back Rodon's red-maned forces, even as their general somehow, impossibly, remained standing. And in that moment, with the flowers still blooming and the battlefield still dissolving around them both, Malenia is said to have whispered something into Rodon's ear that this telling will not fully unpack tonight, because its full meaning belongs to a different story already told elsewhere. Miquella awaits thee, she told him. O promised consort, words spoken not for herself, but on behalf of a brother who was not there to speak them himself, delivered in the middle of the single most devastating moment of her own entire life. Aeonian butterflies are said to have scattered for miles beyond the battlefield itself in the hours after the bloom, carried on winds that had nothing to do with any ordinary weather, drifting over villages and outposts that had no idea a war between demigods had even been happening nearby until the sky above them briefly, impossibly, filled with pale, drifting wings. It is a strange and oddly beautiful image to hold next to everything else this particular afternoon actually caused, and tonight's telling does not want to let that strangeness go unmentioned. Even the worst moment of Malenia's entire life produced something that, from far enough away, must have looked for just a few minutes like something closer to a miracle than a catastrophe. Both things are true simultaneously, the way this whole story keeps insisting they are. Devastation and beauty were never actually opposites here. They arrived, as they so often do in this particular telling, at exactly the same moment, wearing exactly the same wings. Neither of them died that day, and neither of them, in any way this world's histories are willing to call decisive, actually won. Rodon's own great rune burned fiercely enough to resist the rot pouring into him, and his body survived, but his mind did not survive nearly so well. He was reduced, in the aftermath, to something closer to a wandering feral beast than the brilliant general he had been that morning. His own soldiers left to hold together what remained of him for years afterward, through festivals and rituals meant to keep whatever was left of his spirit from finally giving out completely. Picture the Redmane soldiers who survived that afternoon, standing at the edge of a field that no longer resembled the field they had marched into that morning, watching their own commander reduced, in the space of a single battle, from the most feared general in the lands between to something that could no longer recognize them at all. There is no surviving record of what that particular grief looked like up close, soldiers realizing in real time that the man they had followed through a dozen campaigns was simply not going to come back to himself. Not that day, not soon, perhaps not ever. What is recorded is what they did next, which was refuse to let him go. They built festivals around him in the years that followed. Elaborate, sustaining rituals meant less to celebrate a victory than to hold together whatever fragile thread of him still remained, the same instinct that drove Finlay to carry Malenia home, expressed instead as an entire army's collective, ongoing refusal to accept that their general was already gone. And the battlefield itself, the ground where two demigods had fought to a standstill neither one could claim, became something new entirely. What travelers would come to call the Swamp of Aeonia, a festering, rot-soaked wound in the earth that has never once healed in all the centuries since, still bubbling and consuming everything that wanders too close to it, exactly as it did on the day it was made. There must have been a last lucid moment in there somewhere, though no surviving text describes it directly, a final handful of seconds where Radon still understood what was happening to him before the rot finished closing over whatever remained of his own mind. This story will not invent what that moment contained, since inventing it would betray the very care this telling has tried to take with everyone it has touched tonight. It will only ask you to hold the shape of it for a moment. A general who had never known defeat, watching his own thoughts dissolve in real time, aware, for just long enough to understand it, that the woman standing across the field from him was undergoing exactly the same unmaking he was. I want to pause tonight's story here for just a moment before we return to what happened to Malenia herself in the aftermath. I do not usually ask anything of you during these long nights together, and I am not going to make a habit of it now. But if a story like this one, told slowly and carefully in the dark, is something you find yourself coming back to, a small like or subscription helps this channel keep finding people who need exactly this kind of quiet company at the end of a long day. That is all. Now, gently, back to the swamp and to what was left standing in it once the flower had finished blooming. Radon's fate is a story this channel has already told you in full elsewhere, what became of him afterward, and stranger still, what he eventually became centuries later in a realm beyond this one. Tonight is not that telling. Tonight belongs to Malenia, and to what the Battle of Aeonia actually cost her, underneath the rune texts and the ruined landscape and the legend that would eventually grow up around her name. She won nothing that day, in any sense that mattered to her personally. She lost the one piece of engineering that had let her live something resembling an ordinary existence for her entire adult life. She lost her needle, and with it, whatever fragile control she had ever had over the god that had chosen her before she could even speak. And in the wreckage of all of that, unconscious, spent, quite possibly dying, she was, in the truest sense this story has to offer, completely alone, except that she was not quite alone, not entirely, not yet. Rest now. When we return, we will meet the one person who refused to leave her there. Chapter 7: What Finlay Carried. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow all the way down again, further than you think it can go. What follows is, by a wide margin, the single most important image this entire story has to offer, and it survives, as so much of the truest lore in this world survives. And nothing more than a handful of lines attached to an object almost no player ever pauses to read twice. Let it arrive slowly. It deserves that. Among the Cleanrot knights who marched south with Malenia to Caelid, there was one named Finlay. When the battle ended, when the flower had finished blooming, and the rot had finished spreading, and Radon's mind had finished dissolving into whatever remained of him afterward, almost none of Malenia's army was left standing at all. Finlay was one of the very few who survived. And in the wreckage of that battlefield, with the rot still spreading, and the ground itself still transforming into the swamp it would remain for centuries afterward, Finlay found her fallen commander, unconscious, spent, and made a choice that this world's own texts describe, in language it almost never uses so plainly, as an unimaginable act of heroism. She carried Malenia, not for a short distance, not to some nearby shelter, but the entire way home, back across the whole ruined length of the path they had marched together only days before, back through Limgrave, back through Aeonia, all the way to the Halictree that Miquella had built. And she did this alone. The text is explicit about that. And the story asks you to sit with it rather than let it slide past as simply one more detail among many. Finlay did not have an escort. She did not have reinforcements waiting somewhere along the route to relieve her of the burden she was carrying. She fought off every threat that crossed her path across an enormous, dangerous stretch of this world. A single night, exhausted, almost certainly wounded herself, carrying the full weight of a sleeping comatose demigod on her own back, because there was no one else left standing who could do it, and because she had decided, somewhere in the middle of that impossible journey, that she was simply not going to let her commander die alone in a swamp that had once been a battlefield. This is the moment this entire telling has been building toward since the very first chapter tonight, and it is worth naming exactly why it matters so completely. Malenia's whole existence, up to this point, has been defined by forces entirely outside her own control. The rot chose her before she could speak. Her brother's love, however genuine, built the only shape her life was allowed to take. The vow that sent her to war was never hers to begin with. Even the battle that broke her needle and released the flower inside her happened to her, rather than by any real choice of her own making. And here, in the aftermath of all of that, in the single moment where Malenia herself had absolutely no agency left at all, unconscious, unable to choose anything, someone else chose her anyway. Not out of duty alone, though duty was certainly part of it. Finlay carried her because Malenia mattered to her, personally, completely, enough to risk everything on a road with no reinforcements and no guarantee of survival. Think about what this means set against everything else in this story. A god that wanted nothing but a wound to live inside. A war fought over a promise that was never Malenia's own. And then, quietly, almost invisibly, tucked into two brief lines most players will never read at all. One single act of love that asked for nothing in return and expected no reward, given freely by someone who simply refused to let the person she served die, forgotten in a swamp. This is worth sitting with longer than the story strictly requires, because it may be one of the gentlest true things this entire world has to offer. A clean-wrought knight carrying a sleeping goddess across the whole broken length of a continent alone. A story that gets 2 lines in an item description most people scroll past without a second look. It is more affecting, in its own quiet way, than almost anything else this telling will give you tonight, precisely because it asks for nothing and receives, from most of the people who ever encounter it, almost nothing in return. It is worth asking, honestly, what separates what Finlay did from everything else this story has shown you about devotion so far. Because on its surface, it looks almost identical to Miquella's own devotion, or to Morgoth's, or to any of the other totalizing loyalties this world seems to produce endlessly. The difference is small, and it matters completely. Miquella's love for his sister, however real, was tangled up with his own need to fix her, to prove that his years of study and sacrifice had meant something. To be the brother who finally succeeded where the Golden Order had failed. Finlay wanted nothing from the woman she was carrying, not gratitude, since Malenia was unconscious the entire journey and would likely never learn any of the specific dangers Finlay had fought off alone to bring her home. Not glory, since a single night hauling a sleeping body across a ruined continent is not the kind of deed anyone writes songs about, and none were written about this one. It is perhaps the only act of love in this entire story that asked absolutely nothing back, and it is worth remembering that fact the next time this telling returns to grander, louder forms of devotion, because quiet ones like this rarely get remembered at all unless someone chooses, deliberately, to say them out loud. There is a version of this story where Finlay simply gets a statue somewhere, a monument, a name carved into golden stone for the rest of history to remember her by. That is not the version this world actually gives her. She survives only as a handful of lines on a spirit ash most players summon for a single fight and then forget about entirely, her heroism folded into a tool rather than a legend. It is worth sitting with the unfairness of that for a moment, even though unfairness is not really the point of naming it. The truest acts of love in this story are, again and again, the ones history was never particularly interested in preserving carefully. That does not make them smaller. It only means somebody has to choose to say them out loud. The way tonight has chosen to say Finlay's name out loud, clearly, on purpose, rather than letting it stay buried in an object most people will only ever use once and never think about again. Finlay succeeded. She brought Malenia home, back to the tree her brother had built. And there, at last, Malenia was allowed to simply stop, to rest, to sleep, for the first time in longer than this story can accurately measure, without a war happening somewhere inside her own body while she did it. Sleep well, if sleep is already finding you here. When we return, we will see what that long sleep actually cost the tree that sheltered her, and what happened to the people who found their own way to her, in the years while she waited for a brother who was not coming back. Chapter 8. The Ones Who Bloomed from Her. Welcome back. Settle in, wherever you are tonight. What follows is a quieter thread than the battle we have just left behind, and it asks something a little different of you than the rest of tonight's story has asked so far. It is not, primarily, a story about Malenia herself. It is a story about what her rot left behind in the world, once the Battle of Aeonia had scattered pieces of her far beyond her own body's borders. In the swamp of Aeonia, in the very place where Malenia had been broken open and her needle had shattered, a sorcerer named Gowry found something in the years that followed. Not survivors of the battle in any ordinary sense, something stranger. A group of young women, afflicted with the same Scarlet Rot that lived inside Malenia herself, discovered in the swamp and raised by Gowry afterward as his own daughters, though none of them, including Gowry himself, ever seemed entirely certain what they actually were. One of these daughters came to be called Millicent, and her own story, brief and aching as it is, deserves its place here, because it says something about Malenia's legacy that Malenia's own story, focused as it is on gods and battles and brothers, never quite gets to say for itself. Picture that household for a moment, because it is a strange and quietly devastating thing to imagine clearly. An old sorcerer, living at the edge of a swamp that had once been a battlefield, raising a handful of daughters who were not. By any ordinary accounting, actually his, each of them carrying inside her own body a version of the same affliction that had broken a demigod apart in that very place. They trained together. They lived together in whatever fragile domesticity a household built on top of a rot swamp can manage. And each of them, in her own way, was already living inside a question none of them could fully answer for herself. What am I, exactly, and to whom do I actually belong? Millicent did not know whether she was Malenia's sister, or her daughter, or something stranger still, an offshoot grown somehow from whatever the rot had left scattered across that swamp when it bloomed. What is certain, and what the world itself confirms in a detail too specific to be coincidence, is that she carried something of Malenia inside her, literally as well as figuratively. She fought with a Shamshar, bearing the very same devastating technique that made Malenia's own blade so feared, a flowing four-hit combination this world calls waterfowl dance, found nowhere else in the whole of the lands between, except in the hands of Malenia, and in the hands of this one uncertain young woman who might have been grown from her rotted flesh rather than born from her at all. Gowry sent a tarnished looking for her, ostensibly to help her, and for a while that help seemed to work. An unalloyed gold needle, the very same invention Miquella had crafted for his sister generations earlier, was found and brought to Millicent, and she used it exactly the way Malenia once had, inserting it into her own body to stall the rot consuming her. Regaining strength she had been quietly losing for as long as she could remember. For a while, she was able to simply live, to train with her blade, to want things for herself, small and ordinary things, the kind of wants a person is allowed to have when they are not yet certain their body belongs entirely to something larger than themselves. What Millicent did not know, and what this story asks you to sit with honestly rather than looking away from, is that Gowry had another purpose in mind for her the entire time. He intended, eventually, to have her killed, alongside her remaining sisters, so that she might be reborn as what this world calls a Scarlet Valkyrie, an offering made at the moment Malenia herself finally ascended to full godhood. Millicent was never meant, in Gowry's own plan for her, to remain simply herself for very long. She was meant to become raw material for someone else's transformation, exactly the way so much of this story's rot eventually consumes individual people in service of something larger and less personal than any one life. And here, at last, is the piece of Malenia's story that Malenia herself never got to have. Millicent was given a choice, whether to remove her needle, let the rot finally take her fully, and become part of whatever larger godly bloom Malenia's ascension was meant to produce, or to keep her needle in, hold on to whatever remained of her own individual self, and simply live out whatever life was left to her as Millicent and no one else. She chose herself. She took the needle out, in the end, not because she wanted to die, but because she wanted to die, if she had to die at all, as herself, rather than live on as some larger, borrowed purpose wearing her face. Picture the moment itself, because it is worth seeing clearly before this telling moves past it. Millicent, needle already removed, waiting in a quiet corner of a ruined church built for people afflicted exactly the way she was, as her own sisters arrived to finish what Gowry had always intended for her. Whoever finds her there is handed the same choice the rest of this story keeps circling back to, again and again, in different shapes. Help her die entirely on her own terms, standing against the very family that raised her, or let the larger design proceed the way Gowry always planned it. The lore does not resolve cleanly which choice this world considers correct, and it should not, since both readings preserve something true. Fighting alongside her honors a person's right to choose her own ending. Standing aside honors an old sorcerer's belief that a larger, stranger purpose deserved to be fulfilled, regardless of what any single daughter wanted. Tonight's telling will not pretend one of those readings is clearly the correct one. It will only say that Millicent herself, given the chance, chose the first one, and that choosing it at all in a story built almost entirely out of people who never got to choose anything is worth remembering long after the details of the fight itself have faded. It is worth sitting, too, with the sisters who came for her, because they are easy to write off simply as the antagonists of this particular thread, and that would be too small a reading of what was actually happening. They were not cruel for its own sake. They had been raised by the same sorcerer, afflicted with the same rot, told the same story about what their collective ending was supposed to mean, and most of them, unlike Millicent, chose to believe it, or perhaps simply lacked whatever small specific spark let Millicent imagine a different ending for herself. Both readings exist, and neither one condemns them entirely. This is worth remembering the next time this story asks you to grieve for someone who chose differently than you might have wished. Not every sister who came to end Millicent's chosen life was a villain. Some of them were simply further along the same road Millicent had also been walking, and had already decided, quietly, that surrendering to what the rot wanted might be easier than fighting it the way she had chosen to fight it. Sit with that for a moment, set directly against everything Malenia's own story has shown you tonight. Malenia never once got to make that choice. The rot took her before she could speak. Her brother's love decided the shape of her life before she was old enough to have an opinion about it. The war that broke her needle was never hers to begin with. And here, in a swamp far from any battlefield, a young woman who might be nothing more than a fragment of Malenia's own discarded flesh, finally facing the exact same choice her possible mother, sister, or origin had never been offered, chose differently than the rot had always tried to choose for her. Not a triumphant ending, a quiet one, but a chosen one, and that alone makes it different from almost every other moment in this entire telling. It is worth being honest, too, about how uncertain even this small mercy actually is. The rot inside Millicent, like the rot inside Malenia herself, was never described anywhere as curable, only as something that could be delayed, held back, managed for a while by gold and by will. Nothing in this world's surviving fragments promises that removing herself from Gowry's plan meant removing herself from the sickness entirely. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that Millicent's story ends the same way so many rot stories in this world end, quietly, alone, on her own terms rather than someone else's. But not necessarily for very much longer than she would have had otherwise. The lore does not resolve this cleanly, and tonight's telling will not pretend it does. What changed was not how much time she had left. What changed was who got to decide what that remaining time actually meant. Rest now. When we return, we will go back to the tree and to the goddess who finally woke inside it centuries after Finlay first carried her home. Chapter 9: The Goddess Who Woke. Welcome back. Let everything slow down around you one final time before this part of the story begins, because what follows is the ending most of the lands between actually knows Malenia by, even though it is, by any honest accounting, one of the very last things that happened to her rather than the whole of who she was. She slept in the Halid tree for a very long time, long enough that the tree itself, nourished by her brother's blood but slowly infiltrated by her own rot in turn, began to wither around her, its golden boughs turning the same sickly color as the affliction she had never asked to carry. Long enough that Miquella himself never returned to check on her, his own fate, kidnapped and held elsewhere by another demigod entirely. A story this channel has already told you in full on a different night. Malenia waited for him anyway, unconscious and unaware of how much time had actually passed, guarding a home built out of love that had quietly and without anyone intending it begun to rot from the very devotion that once sustained it. When a tarnished finally reaches her, deep inside Elphael, she wakes, and her very first words describe, better than almost anything else in this entire telling could, exactly what those centuries of sleep and waiting actually felt like from the inside. I dreamt for so long, she says. My flesh was dull gold, and my blood rotted, corpse after corpse left in my wake as I awaited his return. Listen to what that confession actually contains. Not a proud recounting of victories, a tired admission that every single person who ever found their way to her over those long centuries died there, one after another, while she waited for a brother who was never coming, her own body still slowly failing the entire time. Gold and rot, both present at once, exactly the contradiction her whole existence had always been built from. And then, still, even after all of that, she offers her old title one final time, the same words she has carried since she was young enough to first take up a blade in her brother's name. Heed my words, she tells whoever has come to fight her. I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and I have never known defeat. It is worth sitting with the fact that she says this immediately after describing centuries of grief and waiting and rot. Not X, but Y. This is not simple arrogance. It is the one identity she has left to hold on to, the one thing about herself that has remained constant through a sickness she never chose, a brother who never returned, and a body that has been failing her for as long as she can remember. Whoever she might have been without any of this, this is who the world made her into instead, and by the time a tarnished finally reaches her, it may be the only self she has left to offer. Picture the room she wakes in, for a moment, before the fight itself begins. A wide, ruined chamber at the very heart of Elphiel, gold gone the color of old bruises, rot creeping across surfaces that were once, centuries earlier, some of the most beautiful architecture the lands between had ever produced. It is worth noticing what has become of the tree by the time a tarnished actually reaches her, because it tells its own quiet story before Malenia even opens her eyes. This was meant to be a sanctuary. What it became, over the centuries of her uninterrupted sleep, was a kind of shared grave, a home slowly consumed from within by the very sickness it was built to hold at bay, waiting the way she waited for a return that never came. The fight that follows is, by most accounts across this entire world, the hardest single trial many tarnished will ever face. Her waterfowl dance, that same devastating technique Millicent also carried, arrives in a blur most players never see coming the first several times it happens, 4 strikes faster than thought, capable of ending a fight in the time it takes to draw a single breath. It is worth noticing what that particular technique actually looks like, beyond simply how dangerous it is to stand in front of. She does not swing a blade the way most warriors in this world swing one. She dances, briefly, violently, weightlessly, the way something already halfway transformed into a flower might move if a flower could still hold a sword. Even in the depths of a duel meant to kill you, some part of what she is becoming is already visible in how she fights. Grace and violence folded together so completely that neither one can be separated from the other anymore. And if the fight continues long enough, if she is pushed close enough to whatever ending awaits her, something in her finally breaks entirely open. Wait, she says, in the moment before everything changes. The scarlet bloom flowers once more. You will witness true horror. Now rot, what emerges from that moment, is not simply Malenia anymore, not in any way that resembles the woman who first spoke to you moments earlier. She becomes, briefly, entirely, the very thing that has lived inside her since before she could speak, a winged, monstrous form this world calls the goddess of rot, healing itself on every wound it deals, the way the rot itself has always fed on decay to produce something new. Sit with the shape of that transformation for a moment. The needle that once suppressed this shattered on a battlefield centuries ago. The sleep that followed meant to let her rest, instead giving the rot centuries of uninterrupted time to finish what it started. And now, at the very end of her long and unchosen life, the god that found her as an infant finally, completely, gets exactly what it always wanted. Not a person anymore, a wound wide enough to live inside entirely. It is worth asking, plainly, whether what happens in this final transformation is a death at all, or something closer to the very ascension Gowry once promised his daughters back in the swamp. This world's own fragments describe Malenia's rise into full godhood as something that was always going to happen eventually, one way or another. The outer god inside her finally completing what it started the day it first found her. Perhaps the tarnished who reaches her at the top of the Haligtree is not interrupting that ascension so much as finishing it, the fight itself becoming the very moment the god sealed inside a princess finally, fully, becomes a god again in its own right, wearing what remains of her as its final shape. The lore does not resolve this cleanly, and it is worth letting it stay unresolved rather than forcing a tidier answer onto it. Maybe this is her death. Maybe this is the one ascension in her entire life that was never actually stolen from her, since by the time it happens, there is no longer enough of the Golden Order or her brother's plans, or anyone else's expectations left standing between her and what the rot always intended her to become. And yet, even here, even transformed into something closer to the outer god than to the woman who bore it, when she finally falls, her very last words are not for the rot at all, and not even quite for herself. Your strength, she whispers, extraordinary, the mark of a true lord. And then, softer still, the words this entire story has actually been building towards since its very first chapter tonight. Oh dear Miquella, oh dearest Miquella, my brother, I'm sorry, I finally met my match. Notice too what she does not say in that final moment, because an absence can carry as much weight as anything actually spoken. She does not curse the rot that consumed her from birth. She does not blame the brother whose vows sent her marching to a war that broke the one piece of engineering holding her together. She does not even mourn, exactly, the centuries of solitary waiting inside a tree that slowly rotted around her because of her own affliction. She simply addresses him, gently, the way anyone might address the one person whose good opinion mattered more than every other verdict this world ever handed down about her. Sit with that ending for a moment longer than the story strictly requires. A goddess of decay, in the last seconds of her own existence, transformed into something scarcely recognizable as a person at all. And still, underneath everything the rot ever took from her, her very last thought belongs to her brother. Not fear, not rage at the god that chose her before she could speak. An apology, offered to someone who was not even there to hear it, for finally losing a fight she had spent her entire existence being told she was not allowed to lose. Both things are true simultaneously here, the way they have been true all night. She is, in this final moment, the goddess of Rot, an outer god's chosen vessel completely consumed by what it always wanted from her. And she is also still entirely a sister, apologizing to a brother who built her a tree and a needle and an entire life's worth of devotion, and could not, in the end, save her from any of it. What remains of her afterward, in the quiet that follows a fight like this one, is a rune, the same kind of great rune this world's demigods leave behind when they finally fall. Malenia's own rune, once claimed, carries a strange and telling blessing, one that reduces the healing power of ordinary restoratives while granting, in exchange, a small measure of recovery to whoever strikes back immediately after taking damage themselves. Think about what a rune like that actually describes about the person it came from. Not comfort, not an easy path to safety. a blessing built entirely around answering pain with immediate forward motion, healing available only to those willing to keep fighting back the instant they are hurt. It is, in its own small mechanical way, the truest possible summary of the life this telling has just finished describing. Malenia was never offered the easy kind of healing. She was only ever offered the kind that required her to keep moving forward, wounded, into whatever came next. Sleep well. When we return one last time tonight, we will ask what all of this actually means, and why a story about a woman who never chose anything might still be one of the most honest stories this world has to tell. Chapter 10: What Her Story Argues. Welcome back for the final time tonight. Let your whole body settle now, further than it has settled at any point so far, because what follows asks less of you than anything else tonight has asked, only to listen, gently, to what this long, sad, patient story actually has to say about the kind of life it just finished describing. Malenia never chose the rot that lived inside her body from the very moment she was born. She never chose the needle her brother placed inside her, however gratefully she may have come to depend on it. She never chose the title that would define her for the rest of her existence, blade before sister, weapon before self. She never chose the war that broke that needle, or the flower that bloomed out of the wreckage, or the centuries of sleep that followed, or the slow rot that consumed the very tree built specifically to save her. At almost no point across this entire story did anyone, God or brother or circumstance, pause to ask her what she actually wanted for herself. This is worth naming plainly, the way this telling has tried to name every hard truth plainly tonight, rather than letting it soften into something more comfortable. Malenia's entire existence is a story about what happens when devotion, however sincere, however loving, forgets to ask the person it is devoted to what she might have chosen instead. And yet, it would be its own kind of dishonesty to end there, as though her story were only ever a tragedy and nothing else. Because inside that same unchosen life, real things happened that were not imposed on her from outside at all. Finlay's choice to carry her home, alone, across an entire continent, asking for nothing in return, was not something the Rot demanded or the Golden Order required. It was one person's own decision to love another person enough to risk everything for her. Millicent's choice, centuries later, to remove her own needle and die as herself, rather than live on as someone else's larger purpose, was not something Malenia's rot dictated either. It was a small, fragile act of self-determination growing directly out of the wreckage the rot had left behind. Proof that even the most thoroughly unchosen inheritance can still produce, somewhere down the line, a person capable of choosing differently. Think, too, about everyone else this story touched along the way. Because Malenia was never the only person the rot ever reached. Loretta, who built a sanctuary for a persecuted people, and died guarding its threshold, unable to tell friend from threat in time. Finlay, who chose entirely on her own to carry a sleeping goddess home across an entire ruined continent, asking for nothing in return. Millicent and her sisters each handed the same impossible inheritance, and each answering it differently, one choosing herself, others choosing to disappear into something larger. None of these people were given an easy story. All of them, in their own way, found some small room inside an unchosen life to actually choose something, however small, however costly. That may be the truest thing this world ever says about the people who orbit its gods and its demigods and its endless golden wars. Almost nobody gets to choose the shape of the disaster they are born into. Nearly everyone, if they look closely enough, still finds one moment where the choice was actually theirs. This is the fourth and final thing this telling wants to leave you with tonight. The same argument this channel has made before and will likely make again, because this world seems built in its own quiet way to keep proving it true. Ambiguity is the most honest position a story like this one can take. Malenia's life was not simply stolen from her by forces beyond her control, though much of it plainly was. And it was not simply hers either, shaped freely and fully by her own choices, because it plainly was not that either. Both things are true simultaneously, the way they have been true about nearly everyone this story has touched tonight. She was a victim of a god's indifferent hunger, and she was also within the narrow space that hunger left her. Capable of real love, real loyalty, real grief, offered freely to a brother who never stopped trying to save her even when saving her proved impossible. Consider, too, what her story means for the wider, indifferent world that surrounded her, beyond the small circle of people who actually loved her. The Golden Order never had to reckon honestly with what it did to her, because it never framed anything as having been done to her at all. Rot was simply misfortune, in its own telling, an unfortunate accident of birth rather than a predictable outcome of a family already fractured by its own ruling goddess's hidden nature. Empires rarely have to answer for the wounds they produce as long as they can describe those wounds as accidents of fate rather than costs of their own architecture. Malenia's suffering was, in the Golden Order's own quiet accounting, simply bad luck, a tragic footnote to an otherwise glorious lineage, never once treated as evidence that something in the foundation itself might need examining. What does it mean, in the end, that the single most devastating weapon in this entire world belonged to a woman who never wanted to be a weapon at all? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. The game does not resolve this cleanly, and neither will tonight's telling, because resolving it cleanly would be its own kind of lie about a life that was never clean to begin with. What can be said, honestly, is this. Malenia's story is not really about rot. In the end, however much rot fills every chapter of it, it is about what a person is allowed to keep of themselves when everything else about their life, their body, their name, their war, their sleep, has already been decided by someone or something else. She kept very little. A brother's name on her lips at the very end, a title that was never fully her own, and still somehow enough of herself survived all of it to apologize, honestly and completely, in the last seconds of her own existence, to the one person who had loved her imperfectly and tried for the whole of both their long lives to make that imperfect love enough. There is a way of hearing a story like this one that turns it into a simple warning, a lesson about the dangers of loving someone too completely or trusting a family that will always fail you in the end. Tonight's telling would rather you heard it differently. Miquella's love for his sister did not fail because love itself is dangerous. It failed because no single person, however devoted, however gifted, can substitute for the one thing an ailing person actually needs most, which is to be asked, honestly and repeatedly, what they themselves would choose if choosing were ever fully theirs to do. That is not a flaw unique to a golden Empyrean prince in a world of outer gods and shattered rings. It is a very ordinary failure, dressed up tonight in extraordinary clothes, and it is worth carrying gently back out into your own life, wherever devotion and true listening have quietly drifted apart from each other without anyone quite noticing when it happened. It rarely is enough in this world. That is perhaps the saddest and the most honest thing this story has to offer you tonight, and yet it is also, somehow, not nothing. There is a particular kind of comfort available in a story like this one, even at its saddest, and it is worth naming before this telling lets you go for the night. Malenia's story is not comforting because it ends well. It does not end well, not by any ordinary measure of what a good ending looks like. It is comforting instead because it insists, quietly and repeatedly, that an unchosen life is not automatically a wasted one, that love given inside a cage is still real love, that a single act of loyalty, offered freely by someone who expects nothing back, can outlast the god that tried to consume everything else about a person. Wherever you are tonight, Whatever you came into this story carrying, let that be the thought you carry back out of it. Not everything can be saved. Some things can still, in spite of that, be loved completely anyway. Chapter 11. Sleep, Coda. Rest now. Let your breathing slow all the way down, softer than it has been at any point tonight. Feel the weight of the blanket over you, or the cushion beneath you, or whatever quiet, familiar shape is holding you right now. You do not have to think about rot, or gods, or brothers, or needles anymore tonight. You only have to notice how heavy your own body has finally become. Settled, unhurried, done with the day at last. Somewhere far from here, in a story that was never quite yours to carry, a tree still stands, gold and rotted both at once. And a long war finally ended in an apology nobody was left to hear except the dark around it. You do not have to hold on to any of that. You only have to let it drift somewhere nearby, soft and unthreatening, the way this whole night has tried to be soft and unthreatening for you. If anything about tonight's telling settled somewhere tender in you, let it settle there gently, and let it stay soft rather than sharp. A woman who never once got to choose the shape of her own life still found small rooms inside it, here and there, for people who chose to love her anyway. That is enough of an ending for tonight. It does not need to resolve into anything neater than that. Whatever tonight actually gave you, a full story followed, start to finish. Or only a handful of fragments before your own sleep arrived first. Both are exactly right. There was never a version of this where you were meant to stay awake for all of it. That was true from the very first chapter, and it is still true now, however far you actually made it. Thank you for spending these hours here, wherever you are, whatever kind of day led you to this quiet room tonight. It means something to me that you chose to let this be the last voice you heard before sleep found you. The tree is still standing. The flower is still blooming, somewhere far away. You do not have to watch it anymore. Sleep well.